Okay, let's get things started with our first panel, enabling auto ID technologies, reducing the burden in the current applications. Our speakers today are Lori Bitar, Market Development Manager at Flexcon, Tony Funk, President and CEO of Spotsy, and Brian Schmidt, Principal IT Specialist at McKesson. Lori, I believe you're going to open things up by going over today's session in a little more detail, so take it away.
Thank you, Michael, and welcome everyone. So in today's session, we are enabling auto ID technologies, reducing the burden in the current applications. I am delighted to be the moderator for this panel of industry experts, including Brian and Tony. Auto ID technologies have been around for many years, enabling many industry applications. In this session, we will provide an historical snapshot of examples over time, as we discuss how auto ID technologies reduce the burden of compliance and provide insight into the current DSCSA applications driving authenticity to enable a safe, secure supply chain. So we'll jump right in. Tony, would you please like to explain the different technologies, both current and emerging, in terms of addressing the Drug Supply Chain Security Act compliance?
Certainly, Lori. Thank you, and thanks to AIM for this opportunity to have a conversation with Brian and Lori, and even more broadly share with the rest of the team here some different thoughts and have a meaningful discussion on this. You know, it's interesting as you look at all the different technologies, you can actually follow them as they go along a traditional diffusion of innovation curve. You know, with respect to all the different types or methods of really, what are we talking about? Record keeping that's modifying or changing into track and trace among multiple different players in a supply chain. Specifically in this case, you know, it's the pharmaceutical supply chain. And if you went, you know, back in time and you just said, okay, how were things done? Well, obviously, you know, you take it all the way down to the last point before you reach a consumer of a medicine. As an example, you know, manual record keeping used to be the way, and believe it or not, manual record keeping is still the way for many a small pharmaceutical dispensary out there in the world today. You know, and if you just followed a traditional diffusion of innovation curve, you could say, hey, you know, there's about 16% of the market out there that's still actually doing that, right? Which is obviously laborious and you know, obviously not sustainable if someone were asking for the information. And the market evolved ultimately into what we call a 1D barcode, right? And so, you know, obviously the benefits of serialization, but you know, there's not as much information and not as tight of security associated with a 1D barcode, and there's other elements there as well of, you know, specificity between different participants in the supply chain. So a manufacturer may have a different 1D barcode or not even readable than a wholesaler, than a pharmaceutical dispensary. And then it actually gets even a little bit more interesting as we start to think a little bit further down and how the market's been evolving into ship direct to home for patients and consumers, right? So how do I read and understand whether or not my medication that I received at my doorstep is real, right? Is counterfeit or versus counterfeit, or how do I understand if it's real or if there hasn't been a condition excursion in some way, shape, or form that could render it ineffective, temperature excursion as an example. So, you know, that leads way to really where, from a DSCSA standpoint, drug in the supply chain security standpoint, we're seeing, you know, this new, in some ways new, but you know, in some ways, you know, a little bit old, but where the adoption of QR codes, 2D barcodes are coming into play. I think that's really interesting about that is, you know, you just look at the role that the pandemic has played in a number of different types of technologies and methods, and you know, where it used to be a QR code was you know, something just on the back of your package, now is this integrated information source for all of us. You know, you think about how you use menus even today, right? We're scanning QR codes to get that. We're using QR codes that are part of our daily lives because, you know, they're accessible via our mobile phones, and we can get information immediately off of them, but also, there's other logical security benefits, which makes it part of this, an important part that's enabled by Drug and the Supply Chain Security Act, better than say the historical 1D barcode or manual record keeping. But even that, has limitations, and there's elements of efficiency that the markets are evolving toward, that they're saying, hey, I'm a pharmaceutical manufacturer. I'm shipping in bulk. I'm a wholesaler. I'm receiving in bulk and then breaking that bulk down into dispensary units. But even they are breaking it down into individual usable units. And when you have bulk, you don't want or have the time to read every single medication, which, by the way, DSCSA calls for, read and record every single medication as it comes in the door. And imagine it's all boxed up, right? You got to open up every box and then scan and record keep. RFID is a great tool for that, right? So as it comes through the dock door or other methods, you can literally read every single medication, every single pill bottle in terms of unique identification in bulk. Problem is, every homeowner or every dispensary doesn't have a UHF RFID reader, right? So now we look at what's happening from an innovation standpoint and how things are starting to evolve. And it's really going to be dual chip. So RFID and NFC. Every single one of your phones can actually read NFC. That's how you use mobile payment as an example. That's an NFC RFID chip. So readily accessible by whether it's the patient or the dispensary, but all the way through the value chain. Or a QR code, as mentioned earlier, right? We can read QR codes with our phone, combined with an RFID. So the reason I share all of this, I say, hey, look, right now the majority is defaulting or moving towards the QR code, the 2D barcode. But expect, right? Efficiency will always win. Expect that, as you move back into the value chain, you're going to start to see elements of RAIN RFID coming into play. So hopefully that shares kind of what's going on in terms of the evolution of technologies, available technologies, but also technologies that are ultimately allowed and are allowed for in the writing of the regulations around DSCSA.
Great. Thank you for that explanation, Tony. Brian, how is the supply chain thinking about DSCSA and actually planning for it?
Yeah, Laura, that's a great question. So, we've been working on this for since 2015 when we started to do the lot traceability, and now in 2017, the item traceability. I would say as a whole, we're cautiously optimistic. The optimism really comes from leveraging these existing global standards that AIM and GS1 groups have put together for us, right? And it's really key for companies like McKesson and others to not only leverage a standard that applies to the US, but also can be leveraged for outside the US, trying to get that value proposition as high as possible. DSCSA is a very big endeavor, and it's something that I haven't seen in the industry to date. And it's not really the marking of the serial number, but we're actually called upon to track and trace the serial numbers as it moves through the supply chain. And we know that's been done in some of the food markets for fish, for an example. There's been batch management or batch traceability. In here, we're talking about each sellable unit that needs to be recorded and traced through the supply chain. And just to give you an idea, McKesson alone, we're looking at 1.4 billion serial numbers annually. And that's just not a number that can be easily managed without special purpose tools. The good thing for the industry, I've been privileged to participate in several of the work groups, and it's really great to see all of us come together to really meet this common goal of patient safety. You think of all the manufacturers and all the wholesalers needing to come together and be able to accomplish a goal, but yet keep our competitive advantage. And that's been really key for these standards. Is it doesn't remove that competitive advantage for each one of us, but we're able to allow the conversation to flow and be able to have those conversations. I really, tip my hat off to HDA, AIM, GS1, and the PDG work groups, because they really provide that foundation for the industry to come together. It's been a long time for us to start implementing these. Everything has a really long lead time, and it's all going live at the same time now in 2023. So lots of excitement. and lots of trepidation at the same time.
Okay, that's a great answer. Thank you for your insight on that, Brian. So what are this question goes to both of you, please. And we'll try to break it down here. What technologies are being used to identify product authentication, security, methods for determining suspect products for patient safety? So I'll ask Brian where you see this evolving, and then Tony, I'll ask you from a manufacturer's perspective, how do you see things changing? So Brian, where do you see this technology involving in regards to product authentication and security, suspect materials, et cetera?
Yeah. You know, I when I started this journey, you know, you get indoctrinated a little bit at a time into the various components. And I would say right now we're trying to leverage all available technology to meet this goal for patient safety, right? So if you take a look at the edge devices, you know, you have the 2D data matrix, the RFID scanners, the UFID, NFC, et cetera. We even have cameras, automated conveyors and sorters, right? On the software side, you know, we're utilizing blockchain, right, to help anonymize the data and be able to provide a very secure, unchangeable record of what's happening. We're leveraging in-memory databases, right? And this is really to meet the response times that are necessary to keep the product flowing. You know, that 1.4 billion serial numbers needs to move very rapidly through the supply chain. And in doing so, you know, purpose-built technology needs to be enabled to do that. And then we're also leveraging credentialing to verify authorized trading partners. So when we think about, you know, the security aspect of it, right? When the manufacturer or wholesalers get requests for information, you know, it's really is who is requesting, and are you credentialed and authorized to provide for me to provide that information to you. All of this has been taking place and being implemented in layers over the last, you know, 3 to 5 years. Which is great. You know, speaking of special purpose, I think of the MediLedger network, right? Which most people don't know about, but it's really the backbone of the sellable returns verification routing process, right? And this is key for as product gets reintroduced or returned into the wholesaler, before we have to reintroduce it into the supply chain, we need to verify using the 2D data matrix and call to the manufacturer, say, hey, Mr. Manufacturer, can you authenticate this product, right? In, you know, services like the MediLedger network didn't exist before that. And now that we have a proven technology of being able to very rapidly have the broadband a way of being able to verify individual bottles of medication. So yeah, you know, all of this is great. A lot of exposure, a lot of great technology out there, and you know, all of this is for patient safety. So.
And Tony, from your point of view regarding the manufacturer's perspective?
Yeah, and listen, I mean, say manufacturer, what we manufacture is obviously, you know, the data collection units, right? So how we actually collect the data, but we do business, of course, with and see how the manufacturers are looking at this problem, meaning the manufacturers of pharmaceuticals, the wholesalers, you know, and the dispensaries, and even the direct-to-home shipping. And so from a technology standpoint, I think what's interesting, Brian made a good comment here. You know, the layers of technology, I like how you described that, right? And it's kind of important to visualize that. And if you build it up from the ground up, right? And where we play, Spotsy specifically is, you know, at the data collection point. And so, you know, what we're doing is we're helping to identify whether or not, you know, there's a concern for safety. So whether there's a, you know, some form of a condition change that could render a pharmaceutical ineffective, such as a high temperature or a freezing temperature impact or tilt, you know, especially as we start to talk about therapeutics and proteins, et cetera. So, you know, as we get into those spaces, we're about collecting the data point. Now, interacting with each of these different technologies, like Brian had mentioned, whether that's a QR code or communicating the next layer, I'd say, of the technology is how do you communicate it? So that's a 2D barcode, right? That's an RFID circuit. those are the examples, that at an item level are going to be the most efficient tools from a technology standpoint for someone or for a company to take the information and then efficiently put it into a database. Then you're talking about that layer of security technology, right? So some form of encryption, blockchain starts to come into play for sure in that, right? Because that's a very, the reason it's exciting and the reason it's starting to be used is because it's an efficient and secure method where you can actually turn users on or off, right? Which is exactly what Brian is talking about. And he's saying, look, I've got, this dispenser customer that, I only want to share this information with, and they only want to share this information back with me. How do I turn that on or off? And then there's, of course, the cloud sharing capabilities as well. So, how do we share and I should say AI? When he mentioned, talking directly to a customer or talking directly to a supplier, he's not literally picking up the phone and talking to those customers or suppliers. You've got AI handshakes basically that are saying authenticated, yes, no, proceed or don't proceed, right? And that all following the DSCSA law. So all this to say, layers of technology. I love that commentary, Brian, but also layers of technology. And then the system is actually the better innovation of all of it, right? So forcing all of these different players, I say forcing because it's regulation, right? We wouldn't do this if we didn't have to, is the way to think about regulation, but it's absolutely necessary for patient safety. And so all these different players coming together to build a process, an innovative process that creates that, secure highway that gathers the data.
Yeah, and Tony, I'll just add here, one of the part of the question is where do we see this evolving, right? So if I look back 20 years or 30 years where EDI started, right, and now today EDI is the main way we exchange information, right? And this is just going to be the next evolution of patient safety, exchanging information. How do we as an industry ensure patient safety going forward? And so, this is just the beginning of what we're looking at.
You got it. I mean, and onto the point of evolution, right? I mean, track and trace is just the beginning, right? And as you start to think about it, and you look at how the DSCSA is written, the specific, objectives of it, it's not just about identifying counterfeit materials or creating protocols for a recall. It specifically calls out condition and suspicious product, right? And under the definitions of suspicious product and condition, you start to see the evolution of a lot of different elements here. Things that in the past, you could only wonder about, and there was tools that you could use, but by no means could even the end patient know whether or not their medicine had exceeded a certain temperature, right? Well, these tools and this highway enables us to do that. So when we talk about evolving further and further, there's the regulatory compliance that's coming in 2023, but then starting to look beyond that and understand, okay, now that we've got this highway and these collection methods in place, what are the other things that we can do with it? And that starts to get very powerful, because when we start to talk about CFR 21, right, which is all about cold chain management, there's a lot of integration that can start to occur with some of the methods that are being put in place here, which will mean efficiency for everybody in the supply chain.
So you touched a little bit on the different stakeholders in the channel. So specifically, this question is, what are some of the challenges the industry is facing or you face in adopting the technology? So think of those stakeholders, from the manufacturer, the wholesaler, the dispenser, contract manufacturers, and even including the 3PLs. And Brian, I'll have you speak to that first.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, obviously adoption is critical, right? And the only point I'll say on adoption is the sooner everybody adopts, the better we'll get these lessons learned on the table.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Yeah.
As I think of our manufacturing and we were working with our first manufacturers, some of the critical things is really changing and understanding how your processes are going to impact this traceability requirement. And I'll just give you a brief example. One of our manufacturers we were working on started doing some analysis on their aggregation. And for those that don't know, aggregation is basically you have a sealed homogeneous case with one product and there's 24 bottles in there. And the system is supposed to know those 24 bottles, what serial numbers are inside that case. So they started doing some analysis on it. And their findings was it was in the low 20s, low 30s, high 20s%, which does not fare well for the industry, right? So what then they, as you do the root cause analysis to this, what they found was their quality team would go out and they're watching the product, inspecting the bottles, and they have a habit of just grabbing a bottle off the line, inspecting it, and putting it back, without realizing that they now just changed the sequence of serial numbers that's going down the line in this and disrupted the system, right? So that's just one of many things that we're going to encounter as we start implementing and leveraging traceability that we're going to uncover and going forward. When I think about the 3PLs, the third party logistic companies, part of their key role is to help their clients understand DSCSA. When you think of a new thing, we all think about the Pfizers and Moderna, right? These very large companies that have lots of resources. But the reality is, when a new drug comes into being, comes into approval, it's a very small entity, and they not always have the resources needed to facilitate or understand the impact of DSCSA. And unfortunately, we've seen some launches be delayed because they didn't understand that aspect of it. And then from a wholesaler perspective, our challenge is really, how do we deal with this large volume of 1.4 billion, right? And how do we deal with having to, take a look at looking at truckloads of serial numbers and product and matching all that up? And we're working really close with our partners, especially on the manufacturing side, right? Trying to partner the timing of when we're going to leverage those serial numbers with the timing of when they're able to ship those, not only the product, but the information to us. And then, on the dispenser side, we're really working closely with our independent dispensers. In America, you just go to the drugstore, you get what you need, and you go home. And sometimes you don't realize how many John's pharmacies there are out there that are independent, right, facilitating a need to the community. And so, McKesson plays a big role by offering services to help them host their DSCSA data for them, and to be able to help that for them to comply with the regulations without being able to be impacted. So again, cautiously optimistic, lots of challenges, and the earlier the industry can adopt these, the better off we're going to be from a lessons learned perspective.
It's interesting, Lori. When I think about the supply chain, particularly in pharmaceutical, you've got a pretty significant concentration of the pharmaceutical manufacturers, right? So the top 15 represent a disproportionate amount of the overall market, fragmented there beyond, right? You have a lot of other smaller companies that will be challenged with complying, but in general, a pretty collective group that is, for the most part, has evolved, from a technological standpoint, to track and trace in a very efficient way. When you move into the center of the pharmaceutical supply chain, you have, in particular in the United States, you've got three major players, right? Of which, Brian's obviously one of them. And, those major players are pretty well aligned in terms of technologies and what needs to be done, right? I mean, there's a lot of commonality in terms of the systems and the processes and the procedures. So that's a little bit easier too, right? I mean, again, they're collecting bulk and breaking bulk. When you get off beyond that, right, you do have some concentration in terms of the retail pharmaceutical landscape, right, where 60% is controlled by what I'd say a consolidated retailer in some way, shape, or form. But that other 40% is extremely fragmented, right? You've got something like 60,000 different pharmaceutical and dispensary outlets out there in the world, or in the U.S. in particular. And so, commonality of technological, capability is very difficult. So when we talk about adoption hurdles, it's that last, mile really, or miles of that pharmaceutical supply chain. That's the biggest challenge, right? And when Brian says, hey, we got to get make sure you're moving towards this, right? Make sure you're adopting. I mean, I think that's what worries me the most for the supply chain is all of these smaller pharmacies that are out there and dispensaries that are out there. Could even be an independent hospital that's out there that, you know, is either doing independent, either doing manual record keeping or 1D barcode today, and just simply aren't able. And the consequences are going to be stiff, right? So I think that the government has already shown that they're not willing to budge, right? There's not a lot of gray area. In fact, the budging has occurred. COVID bought some people some time, some companies some time. But you know, it's kind of like get on board or watch out. Is a scary thing. And one thing that is refreshing to see in terms of evolution is, you know, the role that the wholesaler is playing with those dispensaries, because ultimately those are, you know, their channel partners. And you know, where the dispensaries are offering services to get into compliance. I think that's really smart, right? Really helpful. Nobody needs to recreate the wheel. There's experts out there that can help, and kind of the free market starting to play its role in a regulated environment. I love to see that. There you go,
Okay,
Brian. There's a pitch, by the way, for your DSCSA services. Unintentional, but
Okay, great conversation, gentlemen. Now moving more to the role of the label. And I guess, Brian, I'll target this question to you to start off. And then Tony, obviously, if you can explain a little bit more about the technology to enable, but how has the role of the label changed as a result of the DSCSA?
Yeah, you know, the as we all know, the label is really what patient safety is really riding on, right? This is how we're going to authenticate on the individual sellable units, how we're going to track those serial numbers through the supply chain. But most people don't realize that as important is the case labels, right? The sealed homogeneous cases. You know, the manufacturers spend a lot of time making sure that the unit of use bottles are very pretty, very durable, last the test of time, so that there's no disruptions, but often pay little attention to the case labels. You know, as the cases move out, or the pallets of cases that move through the supply chain, each one of those case labels is just as significant as the label that's printed on the unit of use bottles. You know, we currently, you know, we have operations where if we're not able to read those labels, we can just go ahead and put an internal label on the package, and we can still move that package through the supply chain. There's no disruption in the supply chain, right? But going forward, if we're not able to read those serial numbers and the information that's on the case, we now have to, there's a disruption. That product needs to be quarantined, needs to be researched and looked at. And that's the next, you know, next thing that we're going to need to pay attention to as